All right, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to the discussion on The Impossible State, Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament by Wael Hallaq. We're going on to chapter 4 this evening, or morning, whatever the time zone that you're in. Chapter 4 discusses the legal, the political, and the moral. And it's divided into 3 segments. He talks about the first segment being the morality and the rise of the legal. And then the second segment is titled Sacrifice and the Rise of the Political. And then he does his conclusions and comparison in the third segment of the chapter with the moral dimension, with a, he has a concluding remark on that chapter. So he identifies at the beginning of the chapter the problems, the two problems. The first being the dichotomy between what is and what ought to be in the application of the law and then the second problem has to do with the rise of the political. And then he goes on to elaborate. I mean, basically the first segment of the book talks about like I said, the dichotomy that exists as a consequence of modernity. That there was he mentions the Aristotelian view of the world as having an objective from a creationist point of view, and then that transforming and changing after the discovery of after the eminence of the Newtonian concept of mechanical science. So everything has to be calculated. Everything is what it seems, and that man was created to basically possess and rule over nature. So these are the concepts and ideas that he's trying to convey in that segment of the book. Okay, once again, people are just joining in. Welcome everybody.
Can you hear me well? Okay. Yeah, no problem. Okay. I was trying to think what was written in the chapter because I kind of forgot it. But yeah, I now remember it was like about essentially the state having no moral grounds, right? Like that there is no recourse essentially to like, where are you coming from? Why are you saying this is wrong, this is bad, right? They have nothing like that of sorts, right? That even when they try to justify some position, they're essentially like, you cannot justify anything because you don't have anything to stand on, right? I think that was what he was saying in this part of it. And this then gives rise to the state as he describes it, right? This mentality that, the only rule is the law, right? And you can, justify it by something moral, but this changes every 150 years, right? Like, your morality is just a consequence, not the cause of your view of the world.
So true. Once again, I give him credit for essentially saying to Muslims that it is impossible for us to entertain using Western standards of what is a state, what is law, and what is morality as our template going forward. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. He then enumerates quite precisely, I believe, the reasons why Muslims must abandon their infatuation with the modern Western state as a template upon which we can superimpose Islamic values upon. He makes it clear that this cannot be done because the fundamentals of what the West considers moral, considers law, and considers a state goes against the fundamentals of Islam and the Sharia. And so I'm really, really pleased with what he has written in chapter 4 and how he has written it. He has enumerated once again their principles, which he did earlier in the book, and I saw and realized that the very language that they use, the words that they use, make it virtually impossible for anyone outside of their post-Enlightenment philosophy to even have a discussion about their standards for a state or the sovereign rule of a people in a geographic area, that the language itself and the meanings of the words help to, in a circular way, presuppose the correctness of their positions and arguments. You cannot get away from it. And so I found it very interesting, very insightful, and quite thorough. This is a critique of the Western modern state and its philosophical and legal underpinnings that amounts to a takedown of it.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Wahida. Okay, I have a question for everyone who has read the chapter. What has he pointed out as morality? Like, he has tried to define morality the way the West has understood it, and he has tried to explain the way Muslims view morality according to him, based on his understanding of Muslims and Islam. So he's mentioned that in the book. So if there's anyone who can pick up on that, if you've read the chapter.
Yes, well, one of the things he points out is that Latin had been the underpinning of highly educated writing and philosophical thought, and that pre-Enlightenment Latin, in fact, didn't have a word for moral. And that what they did is they took the English word moral, which came into great usage post-Enlightenment, and then retranslated it into Latin as moralis. This, previous to that, this word did not exist in Latin. He's just making up the point that they have made up words and terminology and definitions of those words and the terminology, and that it's post-Enlightenment, and that for all of existence prior to this, no such words and no such terms were in existence. And he pointed out that what century did he say? I believe he wrote the 19th or 18th century. Prior to that, the term moral, as defined in the West, did not exist in Arabic, because there simply was no dichotomy between the moral and what is just and what is legal. These are not separate concepts in Islam. They have been made separate concepts in Western philosophical thought. And prior to the Enlightenment, they actually weren't really separate concepts in Europe. That this is latter-day thinking and scholarship, and it has caused so many problems because their concept of matter as simply brute, inert, existence, that's fundamental to their concept of we have every right to dominion over matter in all of its forms. And this is not an Islamic concept. And there are so many others enumerated in this chapter, and it makes it clear that it's very difficult for anyone outside, as I said, of the Western philosophical thought matrix to even have a discussion about these issues, because the West has completely co-opted language.
Yes, he points out that this question of morality, like why be moral, is just a modern phenomenon of the Western-centric state, paradigmatic state. He says that in for the Muslims, there's again, like you pointed out, there's no dichotomy. There's never a question on morality because everything we do is to be a good human being. He points out the word akhlaq that is
yes,
that we
yes.
use, for us.
Take the word right out of my head. Yes.
He references akhlaq as our term for morality. He just says that when talking about morality, the Muslims talk about akhlaq, and that we never had that dichotomy because, to be good is a given.
Yes.
That's the point that he was trying to raise. And then
that's beautifully said. To be good is a given, and they just have no basis for that belief when that belief is fundamental to us.
Yes. I mean, just to cite some lines from his book, I mean, from that section on morality and the rise of the legal. Okay, so he says that the law can achieve validity only by virtue of a government that has a power to command and to declare the law to be valid. Okay, the morality and ethics must rest on the objective laws discovered by human reason and not on tradition or spiritual authority. So this is the basis, and
that is their basis is exactly why I, as an African American, and my parents suffered greatly under their laws.
Just going back to some of the things that Shahid talks about in his last video about just dominion and control over resources. I mean, Wael also talks about the fact that they use the phrase "knowledge is power." The fact that you acquire information, you acquire knowledge only to acquire resources and to exploit and to basically assert your dominion over the world. You basically man has become the Godhead,
Yes.
instead. So that's essentially what he's saying in the first segment of the chapter.
I have a problem with some of the basic precepts here, in that, as I have said many, many times, I don't see that they've changed in any way whatsoever from pre-enlightenment to enlightenment to post-enlightenment to modern age, pre-modern age, whatever. I don't see any change. And I don't think that it's accurate. I think, like when he said, I can't remember what the quote was now that you just gave, where laws have to be derived from rational conclusions or whatever, and not from spiritual or from traditional sources and so on. That's them talking about what they pretending that that's what they do, because they're still following the same things that they've always followed. The roots of all of their so-called laws and so-called morality, all of it comes from the pre-enlightenment age. All of it comes from whatever they got from the Bible and from the church and so forth, and from before that. I mean, their Christianity anyway, as Wael has pointed out in interviews, their Christianity was radically different from the Christianity that was practiced in the Middle East and other parts of the world. The European Christianity was pagan and mixed with paganism and mixed with all of their strange beliefs that they had prior to the coming of Christianity. They incorporated all of that. But there's not really a change, and the sources of their, as I say, the sources of their so-called morality are all sourced from pre-Enlightenment. They just come up with an intellectual rationale for it and pretend that it's from some rational process, but you're just following the same things that you always followed. So, I mean, I have a problem with even uh, agreeing to go along with the European definition of a pre-Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, and that there was even something called the Enlightenment in terms of it being something that drastically, radically changed you as a civilization, so-called, because that's not a thing that happened. The only thing that happened with the so-called Enlightenment, as I've said many times, is just changing who the authorities were. But it didn't change anything about your actual morals or your morality or your approach to the world. And it was always in terms of like what he said about what the validity of the law requires a state or whatever. That's just a club. It just means a club that can beat you over the head and make you do this or that. And that was always the way you were. There was never any internalized morality, any internalized goodness, any internalized ethics or principles or values. It was always might makes right, and it's just whether that might is the head of the clan who has the biggest spear, or the might is the state, as you call it, the state. It's the same thing. There hasn't been any change in these people.
He's saying that modernity, the modern state, is a consequence of, like if you look at a timeline of history, okay, and so it's an evolution of human beings existing as a society, and we've arrived at modernity, and it's a enlightened state. So to look back is a regression, right? You're going backwards.
But you see, but my point is that that's just believing and going along with their myth about themselves. That their that their so-called modernity is any different than their primitiveness. There's no difference. This is what I'm saying. Just because you've changed doesn't mean you've evolved. Just because you have whims and desires today and different whims and desires tomorrow doesn't mean that you have matured. It just means that you just do different things and you have different urges and desires. That's all it means. And that's how they have lived, and that's how their society has been. Their so-called civilization has been pre-Enlightenment, Enlightenment, modern era, and into the future. Unless and until they accept Islam, they don't have any system. They just follow their whims and desires, always have. And they just call it, because our whims and desires are different now. They say, well, we've evolved and we're advanced. No, you just changed your appetites. That's all.
I'd like to allow Samira to speak. You can unmute yourself, Sister Samira. And
yes. Okay. I hope you can hear me. So I came late, sorry for that. Maybe you have discussed this one, but it was in the beginning of the chapter that I had, well, some observation about how he is implying that the Muslims are trying to emulate the Western states. I don't know where that came from, because I guess it's because we are in a what he terms it as modern state. And that he's basically saying that in our journey to be a modern state, we are making mistakes. This is his assumption. This is what he's alluding to. It was in the beginning of the chapter. And I was wondering where that came from. Is it because he is of the opinion that we are, at this moment, the Muslim countries at the moment are considered modern state, which he did mention in the beginning of the book, that none of the countries at this moment have Islamic or Islamic kind of governance, and therefore we are considering ourselves modern state. So that was a problem for me, why he thinks that we are trying to emulate the Western state, because that's how he's writing it. And then the second part was about the fact that there is no such thing like the modern state being incompatible with any type of Islamic mode of governance. This is, again, what exactly is the Islamic mode of? Oh, yes, it's the fact that we give more assertion to morality as opposed to legality. This is what he's trying to say. But who is to judge what is Islamic mode of governance? Is it the historical Islamic mode of governance that he's comparing us to? But then there is modernity. There is something that changes with time. And one of the things is that the fact that there is now modern state, whether we like it or not, we cannot escape. But how do we modernize it in such a way that it conforms to our Islamic teachings is one thing that I really had a problem with. He's assuming basically that we are trying to emulate the Western modern state. And then there was another thing that I found. He defined maturity, well, not defined, but from philosophy, like modern philosophy on civilization and maturity is that there is a huge emphasis on the self, and how that to be free is basically an act of civilization, of maturity of the civilization. So free, even to religion, is the thing that he emphasized. That was very interesting. I found that one very interesting, that the freedom is not only freedom from serfdom, from all the oppressions, political oppressions, authority, and all that, but actually to be free from religion or from the confinement of religion is also considered as civilizational or individual maturity from the Western perspective. That was really one thing that I found interesting. But overall, when he was talking about the detachment between the legal and what is and what ought to be, and how that affected even science, how the objectivity of science, that part, that is the only thing that I was giving him credit for, that I was listening to Wael from the terms, from perspective that he is academic. So I would assume that he would be looking at things objectively. But then here again, he's saying that detachment from the reality he's criticizing science for that, which is exactly what he is himself, because he's Christian. He's denying God, yet he is academically trying to prove that. That was really something when I read that. Well, that's what you're doing. I keep saying to myself, well, that's what you are doing. Why? Like, exactly. You are looking at it from scientific, academic point of view, religion, Islam, yet it's not applying to yourself, to himself. So yeah, that was the things that I observed.
Okay, I want to add on about Sharia. Okay, he points to pre-modern, or what he points out to pre-modern Islam, right? He claims in this chapter that it's no longer a thing that exists today. So by that, he implies that there's no such thing as a Muslim government. Okay, that's what I'm understanding. Okay, basically saying that Sharia is institutionally defunct. Okay, and the only how do I say, redeeming thing that I can say, that he suggests that the postmodern Muslim state is not something that's a doing of our own hands. It's a form of coercion. We've been coerced to accept certain modes of government that we have incorporated in our countries, like in Malaysia or in Indonesia or any of the Gulf countries. Okay, like the flaws that he may pinpoint, it's just something not of our own making. It's just something as part of a coercion of existing in the world that's dominated by the West. Okay, that's the only redeeming thing that I can derive from his writing. But essentially, what he's saying is that Sharia is institutionally defunct, and that what that implies is that there's no actually. I mean, basically, he's making takfir on Muslims in Muslim countries. That's how it sounds to me. It's pretty severe. It's quite a stretch that he's doing here.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and which then brings me back to a section in the book, in the chapter, where he talks about what makes a believer and what makes a kafir. And I want to know if anyone has read that section and would like to talk about it.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fahim. I'm sorry, I was also a bit late, but I have been here listening to your discussions for last few, like 15 minutes or so.
Welcome, brother.
Thank you so much. I'm learning so much from everybody's inputs, to be honest. Just, I wondered whether I might talk about a little on the point that you just made, that he's basically making takfir about on the Muslims or the Muslim governments on different parts of the world. in general, what I feel like when I'm trying to read this book, the one challenge that I'm having is basically having different Western terminology and Islamic terminologies, and how we sort of trying to use both of them, sometimes interchangeably, but it is very, very difficult to strike a good balance between these two, I think. And that leads us to this whole problem. For example, what Ustad Shahid was saying, that he doesn't see any sort of difference between what the pre-modern world was and how the modernity or the post-modernity is. And I think he's absolutely correct if we think about it from an Islamic perspective. But if we try to use their words and their terminology and their points of making discernment, then one can understand why and what's the difference between modernity and pre-modernity and post-modernity and all that. And it's the kind of the same. I think if we can approach this book in a way that Halak is definitely someone who is absolutely entrenched within the Western philosophy and within the Western thought process. So if we think about it that way, then whenever he's talking about Islam, he's definitely talking about it from what he can understand using his terminologies like paradigm. What is paradigm in Islam? We have no concept of paradigm in Islam. It's something that they have developed, a tool for thinking, basically. And he's applying that on Islam and trying to understand Islam from that point of view. And then when he takes that and he applies that to moralities and the legalities in Islam, and what he sees is definitely, if anybody tries to see it from that point of view, with rigor, with academic rigor, which I give him credit for, then they would have to come to this conclusion that the way in pre-colonial world, what it was like, if you look at the lens of that paradigm, then the way Islam operated as a government is as a legal entity. And if you compare that with the way Islam is operating as a legal entity and institution in modern states, in modern Muslim states, if you call the previous one Islamic, then you probably will not be able to call the current one Islamic. I don't know if I'm making sense here or not. However, the problem is, if we cannot call this takfir, because if we approach the same, say, it's sort of like this. There are similarities between pre-modern systems and modern systems, and there are points of differences. That much is pretty much obvious. Now, because the Westerners are trying to differentiate between modern and pre-modern, they are putting emphasis on the points of differences, which is why if you apply the same thing to Islam and how the Islamic societies and the countries were before colonialism and now, if you apply the same kind of points of differentiation, then obviously these two will be different. And if you call one Islamic, you will think the other one is un-Islamic. But for us, those points of differences are not what makes something Islamic or un-Islamic. That's what I gathered, to be honest. However, I would still say there is some value in learning what points of differences that the Western people put emphasis on, and what the things that they base their moralities on. The reason being simply because of that fact that they are the ones in power, and we're having to play their game. So it's worth knowing how their game runs and how to beat that. I mean, nobody is discussing whether today's Islam and the Islam of 200 years ago, how it is different or the same from the point of view of Hinduism or from the view of Buddhism. Nobody is discussing about that, because they are not the ones who's making the decision. They are not the ones who's making the world run at the moment. So I think that's the only value there is in Halak, and trying to learn from him, like, and it's a good thing that even approaching it from the approach that we know as Muslim as wrong, even if you approach it that way, he basically comes to the conclusion that that even by their standards, they're not really achieving the things that Islam could achieve by through its own means. So that's the thing, really. Thank you.
Jazakallah, Brother Fahim, for your valuable contribution. That was very insightful. I think it's a very one point that Brother Fahim mentioned, like it's useful to see how power talks about us, from an outsider's point of view.
It's also important, and mashallah, you have the right name, Brother Fahim. There's a very good understanding. It's important for us to understand, as you said, and as Sister said now, what power thinks of us. It's also enlightening that, as you said, Brother Fahim, for some reason, we take it seriously when they talk. If Hindus, and they do, it's not that they don't. Hindus were saying what they think about Islam 200 years ago and now, and they make up all kinds of stories about the Mughals and so on. And we dismiss it out of hand. We immediately recognize it as propaganda, anti-Muslim propaganda and whatever, and that these people aren't qualified to talk about what they're talking about. But when Westerners, for some reason, and I include Wael as a Westerner, even though he's a Palestinian Arab, in his mindset, in his mentality, as you said, brother, he is deeply entrenched in Western philosophy, Western thinking. When they talk about us, we listen for some reason, and we take it seriously. Rather than looking at it, as you said, we can learn from it the way they think, rather than listening to them so that we can learn about ourselves. And that's what the danger is, that if we're going to listen to a Wael or anyone else from their side who sort of pretends to be an expert on our deen and on our ummah and on our law, that we're going to learn from them about ourselves and about our deen and about our ummah and about our law. No, we can't do that. If we listen to them just so that we can know what they think, then it's fine. Then it's valuable. But if we're going to listen to them as if they're our teachers about ourselves and about Islam, then obviously we're going to go astray. And my suspicion always is that that's the only reason they're talking, is actually to change our minds about ourselves and about our deen. They're not doing it because they want us to understand how they think, because they think that whatever they think is right, and they want to change our minds. So I approach someone like a Wael Hallaq and any of these other types, I approach them with a great deal of suspicion with regards to their motives.
All right, so I would like to move on to a critical section in the book where he defines, well, he writes what it means to be a kafir and what it means to be a believer. And it's quite troublesome, to be frank. I mean, okay, so I will just read out the text in which he talks about the kafir. Okay, to be a kafir, a non-believer, is to deny God's good works in nature, to deny the blessings that humans live by and experience in every moment of their existence, and to behave badly towards other people and things, which is to say that one is behaving badly towards God's work and creation, human beings. Thus, owe God the duty of genuine appreciation, the indignant and I'm sorry, that's it. So if you don't show that you're grateful to Allah, that means you are a kafir. That's a very ideological, flowery, I don't know, how do it's just does
What
not
was
seem,
what was the point of him saying this?
yeah, is it to pinpoint that he's not a kafir, or I don't
No,
understand.
I mean, in the context of the book, in the context of the thesis, what's the point of him saying this? Because if you should say what a kafir is in Islam,
Yeah,
not just what you think or what the Christians think or what the modernity. I mean, the sort of the three things that you're talking about. is the Islamic point of view, the
Mhm.
view of modernity, and the view of pre-modernity.
Yeah.
These are like the three things that you're talking about. They're
Yeah.
the views of these three realms. Okay, so in what realm, who thinks what you just said is a kafir? Who and is a believer? Who thinks that? That's not the Islamic view whatsoever, as we
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, he brings about these points about what a kafir is and what a believer is in bringing about the bygone Muslim governance, days of what he thinks is a bygone era of Muslim governance.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then he goes on
Then
to
he should
describe,
use the definition according to that era. He should use the definition of a believer according to that era, and the definition of a kafir according to that era, which is their era and this era and for all time. It doesn't change. The definition of a Muslim, we know what it is.
yes, absolutely.
The five
Absolutely.
pillars of Islam, being a mu'min, the six pillars of Iman, this is what makes you a Muslim, and this is what makes you, inshallah, a mu'min and have Iman. Is this and only this? It's nothing else.
However,
Not being nice.
I know, but he's claiming that he who does not deny God's blessing and his sole sovereignty is a believer.
Okay, and the biggest blessing that you are denying is Islam itself, is
Yes.
denying the Quran, denying Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's the biggest blessing that you are denying, and that's what makes you a kafir. Wael. I mean, this is. Well, I'm just wondering. This is a very strange thing for him to put in the book. It seems to me, without it being a quote from some source that has to do with the way it was viewed in the times of the Khilafah, for example. If you're talking about the so-called pre-modern Islamic governance era, then you should use the definition that they used. Because there you have Muslim, you have the Muslim citizens, you have Ahl al-Dhimma, you know, and there you can talk about the Ahl Kitab, that they qualify for being Ahl al-Dhimma, and so on. You have the people who are from the outside, the kuffar from the outside, who are not citizens of the state, so on. You know, if you want to talk about it in the context of what seems to me to be the thesis of the book, this seems very out of place to just come up with your own personal definition of what a believer is.
Personal philosophical definition of what a believer is.
That has no currency in Islam.
Yeah.
But I think he was trying
He
to
does say,
juxtapose it to like citizenship, right? That like what is a unit of you know, what is the smallest units like making the society in a Sharia manner? It's the believer, right? In a state, modern state notion, it's the citizen. So I think he was trying to, you know, compare these two perspectives. That was the context in what she was speaking about it, in my opinion, if I remember correctly.
Then
Yeah.
he should have used the Shari'i definition.
well,
The believer.
I'm going to read to you exactly what he wrote. It's in front of me, brothers and sisters. Thus, to be a true believer, mu'min, a genuine Muslim, min al-Muslimin, is to appreciate the facts of having been born kulika halq, of having been given family solidarity, family love, and compassion, dawi al-qurba, and having received the gifts of food and pleasant beverages, especially the simplest boon of life-giving water, in sum, of enjoying all the blessings of the world that surround humankind by virtue of God's infinite generosity. To behave badly toward any of these God-given gifts is not only to be thankless or to deny yakfur, kafir, God's sign, ayah, but also to transgress, mujrim, zalim, and the Quran makes it all too obvious that a transgressor's final lodging is in less than a pleasant abode, yusla naran, wasayat masira. That's what he wrote.
Right. Which these everything that he mentioned there, these are all aspects and elements and attributes of Iman. But this is not the definition of a Muslim, not in the Sharia.
Okay, I will read to you what he further wrote. We have thus far remarked on the Quranic conceptual dichotomy and antinomic distinction between believing, iman, and disbelieving, kufr. He who does not deny God's blessings and his sole sovereignty is a believer. But what is it that constitutes the Quranic believer, the mu'min, beyond his or her full acknowledgement of and gratitude for God's blessings? Any perceptive reader of the Quran will immediately note the heavy emphasis placed throughout the text on the act of performing good, yamalun as salahat, in its different variants. It occurs at least 120 times without counting other conceptual cognates such as khairat and asana hasanat, e.g. tatawa, khairan, mayufal minkar, manjabila sana, all of which mean to do good. It is one of the most common and oft-repeated expressions in the Quranic repertoire.
Okay, so he's saying that Amal
he's
Saleh,
again talking about it through the Quran itself, and so I don't think he needs to write the sentence. The people believe in the Quran when he's telling you what is expected of them, you know, by what is some of what is written in the Quran. So anyway, he isn't a Muslim, at least he publicly has never admitted to being one. But what I have gotten from what I have thus far read from the beginning onward is not that he is offering his personal view of the West. He is critiquing its historical, philosophical, and legal text and revealing it to those who may not have knowledge of it. And he is also warning Muslims, and much of the Muslim intelligentsia does this, and it has bothered me for decades. They use the West as the model of what a modern society should be. And they bemoan the lack of constitutions or constitutional written law authority, secular authority in predominantly Muslim countries. They do this. I'm not talking about the regular believer in the society, but I am talking about the intelligentsia that has been produced by Western education. And so he is critiquing those Western standards, and he is warning Muslims. I mean, he wrote this not to use them as our template going forward. And so when I read his writing, having already read from him what he is doing and the warning that he wrote to Muslims in the beginning not to use the West as their template going forward, that what they have, and he wrote this, is far superior to anything the West has to offer. He wrote it. I don't know how some of you may have skipped over that.
no,
And then he proceeded to critique these people. And I take the whole thing as a warning of what's wrong with them. He's living in this. So he's experiencing it as what is wrong with this, and a warning to us not to follow suit.
he's talking about, he's warning us about the media, the negative impact of the Western model, and also trying to educate the ignorant on what Islam is, which is a problem, because he's equating Iman with whatever it is that the flowery language that he's used on, on what Iman is, And he's also saying that what kufr implies is also based on what he thinks from his paradigm. And he's talking to essentially an ignorant audience, because he's not convincing any one of us who has had basic schooling on the basic fundamentals of the religion. You know, he even, okay, you mentioned the essentially is amal soleh. He's saying that, you know, the Quran urges you to do deeds, good deeds, right? And then he goes on to explain something that about the deeds, right? That Allah is self-sufficient and that He's all-powerful, and Allah doesn't need humankind to do these deeds. Although he is now pointing out in a statement that Allah is explicitly grateful for our deeds, okay? And he's citing ayat of the Quran on page 86 that says nothing of the sort, that Allah is, he literally says that Allah is grateful that we are doing amal salih. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. I mean, this is just something completely out of line, you know, and Allah is not in need of our good deeds. And Allah appreciates, Allah rewards
I
us.
thought that his use of the word grateful was ill-advised, but
It's
he's
wrong.
using the English language, and sometimes it's difficult to translate concepts from the Holy Quran, the Arabic concepts, into English.
Yet he
So
pretends to have insights that
No, I mean, it, to translate
our Lord
to translate
rewards
a
us for
concept that's in the
doing good.
Quran, translate a concept that's in the Quran, you should be familiar with the translations of the Quran that are done by professional translators, and you should be familiar with the tafsir, so you should understand it. And anyway, Wael writes in English. He doesn't write in Arabic and then it's translated into English. He writes in English. He's better in English than he is in Arabic. When you listen to him speaking in the interviews, his Arabic is at a simple enough level that I can understand it. So his Arabic isn't that great in normal speaking. Of course, he's not going to speak high language when he's speaking, but the point is he writes in English. These aren't translations of his works from Arabic into English. He writes originally in English. And by the way that the texts are written, I would be highly inclined to believe that he has, if not a ghostwriter, an editor to help him with the writing, because he doesn't write at all the way he talks in English. When I've seen him in interviews in English, he speaks much more straightforwardly and much more clearly and understandably than in the very overly complicated prose that he uses in his writing. And then when he's giving a speech, he's just reading from a paper, and then it mimics the language of the book. It's this very, very highly academic style of language that overcomplicates it. So I think that, you know, it's entirely possible that it was just a poor choice of words that's based on that he may have an editor or a ghostwriter who is like him, not a Muslim, and maybe the editor doesn't speak Arabic, and also that Wael himself is maybe not actually that familiar with tafsir of Quran and the meanings of these, and that doesn't understand maybe the distinction between gratitude and appreciation, that these are two very different concepts. And that, you know, that the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards us for our good deeds is from his generosity, not from his gratitude. Astaghfirullah. So it's, you know, it's a very different thing, but it's just a poor choice of words. But it sort of exposes the, you know, how drastic the difference is between someone writing about Islam or talking about Islam who is a Muslim versus someone writing about Islam who's not a Muslim. There's a huge difference.
Well,
okay.
I agree that there's a huge difference between Muslim writers and non-Muslim writers when discussing anything, especially Islam, and the difference between generous and grateful, you know, is an ocean-wide chasm. You'll get no argument with me from that, but I believe that the book was written for academics. I don't believe it was written for the general educated populace at all.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So
It's definitely written for
know,
academics.
because in America, when you get something published, they ask the question, who is the audience? And then whoever is assigned to be your editor helps keep you on track to writing something that's for that very specific audience. And I believe among the academics in that audience are Muslim academics in the West who unfortunately idolize the West because of its materialism and relative 20th century peace after the conclusion of World War II. And he is warning them not to do so, and that the West has nothing superior to what the Muslims have, and that the West can offer the Muslims nothing with regard to politics, civilization, and belief. I mean, this is what he wrote in the beginning. So
yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But like I said from the very beginning of talking about this book, he attributes the problems of the West to their model, not to their kufr. And this is essentially where he's completely missing the boat. Because for Muslims, it doesn't matter what model it is, we can approach it Islamically. You can put us into any situation and we will approach that situation Islamically. And that's how fiqh works, that's how ijtihad works, and that's one of the most brilliant and beautiful things about the Sharia, is the flexibility and adaptability to all circumstances and conditions and situations. So give us whatever model you give us and we can make it Islamic by our approach to it. That's what he doesn't seem to understand. That the West is the way it is because they are the way they are. Their system is the way it is because they are the way they are. And whatever model they come up with, whether it was, as I said, pre-enlightenment, enlightenment, or modern or postmodern, that model is going to always reflect the contents of their own hearts and minds, which is where you get your problems. And the same will be true for the Muslim world, and is true in the Muslim world today. Whatever, even if we have what you call a modern state model, a nation state model, or what have you, throughout the Muslim world, because it was maybe imposed upon us by colonization. But we approach our situations, we approach our societies, we approach our legislation, we approach our governments, we approach the management of society as Muslims. We approach it as Islamically as we can. There are aspects of the Sharia that are present. There are laws from the Sharia that are present, and there are laws from the Sharia that are absent. But that has been the case for 1,500 years almost. That's almost been the case for the entirety of our history, except for the period of Rasulullah and the Khulafa Rashidin. We've had periods of time where aspects of the Sharia were suspended. We've had periods of time where aspects of the Sharia were more strongly enforced, and even that changed from place to place, not just time to time. But I mean, at any given time, you would have more conspicuous enforcement of Sharia in one part of the Muslim so-called empire, and less in another part. So I mean, these things differ. And then also there's the aspect of something that was talked about earlier. I can't remember exactly at which point it was, about legality and morality. That the Muslims don't make a difference between that, and the kuffar make a difference, or the West, the modern state. For me, it's kuffar. They make a distinction, and that the Muslims don't. But we do. There's a difference between a crime and a sin in the Sharia. Not everything that's a sin has a had punishment attached to it. Not everything that's a sin has legislation attached to it by the state, by the government, by the qadi. And you are required in Islam to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as much as you can in public and in private. And it's your public behavior that the state, or that the government, or that the authorities are concerned about. And not all of your public behavior even necessarily has a prescribed punishment for it if it's a violation of some kind, if it's a sin. For example, there's no had for a woman not wearing hijab, or on and on. There's many examples of things that are sins that if you commit them, you can expect a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless He forgives you, unless you repent, and unless He forgives you or chooses to forgive you. There are people who will say listening to music is a sin, but is it a crime? Is it something that the state can now legislate and say that if you listen to music, we're going to put you in jail or do this or that or the other? No. There's a whole area in fiqh, in Islamic jurisprudence, ta'zir, where there is a punishment that is allowed for the judge, that the judge has judicial license to issue a punishment that hasn't been ordered in the Quran and Sunnah. So that's literally a man-made punishment, a man-made legislation based on maslahah, based on what they think is in the best interest of the society. Okay, it's going to be guided by, most of the time, what is regarded in Islam as a sin, but either way, it's not something in Islam that has been regarded through wahi, through the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the Quran and Sunnah, as something that is a punishable crime. So even we make a difference between moral and legal. Now, if the idea is that in the West, the legality determines morality, that what's legal then is therefore moral, and what is illegal is therefore immoral, you might have an argument for that. Maybe that's the argument he was making. You can't say that we don't make a distinction.
Okay, so is there anyone else who would like to add on the book? I think on the second section on the sacrifice and the rise of the political, basically he talks about the modern subject is by definition a nationalized entity, and the citizen has to sacrifice his life for the sake of his country, and if you're not, then you just have to be ready to sacrifice yourself for the sake of your country. I mean, it's a very generic broad stroke statement about the citizen, and I think it's a rather short segment as well, and I expect elaboration on the next 2 chapters on this area, and we can further explore this in the next coming weeks, inshallah.
Well, assalamu alaikum. I'll say this one last thing. While I was reading this chapter, I kept thinking of Ustad's video in which he says the West never learned how to assign value, because the chapter was full of enumerations of comparisons between this chapter and the previous chapter of how the West went about constructing their current paradigms. And he then interrogated each aspect of the paradigm and showed that it came up far short and that it was absolutely nothing there for Muslims to emulate. And I kept thinking, well, Ustad said that the West never learned how to assign value, and that is what is going on here. They don't know how to do it, and they value that which is in fact of little to no value. And that is how we arrived at the mess we are in today. And assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks, Sheikha.
Wa alaikum salam. Jazakallah khair, everyone. I guess I'm just checking the message. I think this, all right, fact and value. Okay. So if there's nothing else, if no one has anything else to add, we've already crossed 1 hour. Okay, so with that, I will close. Jazakallah khair, and inshallah next week we will have a break for the Eid, and we will follow up the week after, Saturday, the same time.
Just one chapter?
Yes, just one chapter, chapter 5, next week. Okay, assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thanks, everyone. Barakallahu feek.